Let's consider the approach this course employs. In one sense, the climate crisis is being caused by a rise in atmospheric CO2 and other so-called greenhouse gases. Science can address this cause. However, approached in another way altogether, the crisis is being caused by a range of troubling human activities that require the release of these gases. These activities include our obsession in wealthy countries, like the U.S., with endless consumer goods, cars, certain food, lavish houses, fast fashion, air travel, and a broad range of additional lifestyle choices. The natural sciences may be able to tell us how these activities are changing our climate, but not why we are engaging in them. That's a job for the environmental humanities and the social sciences. In Climate Crisis 101, we will be seeing anthropogenic, and by that I mean human-caused, climate change for what it is and address it as such, a human problem brought about by human actions. Thus, we will be taking a long, hard look from the perspective of the environmental humanities at these actions and how they are culturally constructed. In other words, we will be exploring why we as a species do what we do, even when these actions are disastrous for our planet and our species, along with most other species on the planet. While this is arguably an academic question and is interesting in its own right, the course is also meant to be deeply personal insofar as we will be looking at our own actions and how they impact the planet and climate. Moreover, we will not just be considering our individual actions, but also forms of collective climate activism. Becoming engaged and active, whether simply by voting or by becoming a committed climate activist, is of paramount importance if we are to mitigate this crisis. In this course, we will not be focusing on technologically based solutions, rather human-based ones. In other words, instead of looking to technology for solutions to the problem of the climate crisis, we need to look at its causes directly, human action. Well, human action causes the climate crisis. The good news is that human action can go a long way towards solving it. In short, this course is in many respects less about climate change than it is about human change. So why take a human-based approach? Let's take food as our example. As previously noted, the climate crisis can be seen as a human problem brought about by human action. In addition to seeing the problem in this way, the solutions to the crisis that have the greatest potential impact also center on human behavior, and by that I mean cultural norms, rather than just technological innovation. According to Project Drawdown, that's Table of Solutions, Scenario 1, which is the most comprehensive plan ever put forth to reverse global warming, the number one thing that we can do to roll back global greenhouse gas emissions, that's GHG emissions, does not involve wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, or any sort of similar technologies. Instead, what is required is a cultural change regarding food. We need to waste far less of it and to switch to largely plant-based diets. Doing so will result in a staggering reduction of 152 gigatons of CO2 or equivalent gases. In comparison to this reduction, shifting globally from fossil fuels to electricity generated by photovoltaic solar panels will roll back less than half of this amount of emissions. The adoption of electric vehicles, far less than 10%. We should, of course, work on exploring a variety of technologies to help reduce our emissions, but it's also important to keep their relative impact in perspective. Worldwide, agriculture is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, yet between a third and a half of all the food that we produce on this planet is wasted. Regarding the switch to a largely plant-based diet, the same amount of greenhouse gases is released in producing 1 pound of gas as is released in producing 30 pounds of lentils, also a great source of protein. Changing how we eat may not sound nearly as sexy as a self-driving electric car, but will nonetheless be 10 times better for the planet. Let's consider a second example of why we should take a human-based approach. The number two thing, according to Project Drawdown, that we can do to roll back GHG emissions is also a cultural issue that is a far cry from technology. We need to educate more girls and women, which dramatically curbs population growth, as the more education a woman has, the fewer children that she has, and promote family planning. Globally, there are roughly 85 million unintended pregnancies every year. These two things together would roll back 85 gigatons of GHG emissions. This is not to say, of course, that we should place the responsibility for this particular issue with girls and women. To the contrary, the responsibility here lies with the institutions that restrict a woman's access to education and control of her own body. And two, it's obviously the case that contraception is a male responsibility as well. So why is population so important? 60 years ago, around when I was born, the global population was about 3 billion. Currently, it is 7.75 billion. By 2050, it will be approaching 10 billion. The simple fact is that this many people are profoundly taxing the resources of our planet. Hence, reducing the population of our species is one of the main things that we can do to mitigate the climate crisis. However, population is a complicated issue. As we shall see, when people in wealthy countries like the U.S. call for low and middle income countries to reduce their populations, this can sometimes be simply racist. The profound irony here is that the poorest half of the world's population have had a minimal impact on CO2 rise, yet will suffer the consequences of the climate crisis the most. For the most part, these individuals are in low and middle income countries and will suffer because of the actions of wealthy countries like the U.S. Taken together, the two cultural changes regarding food and population can take us nearly a quarter of the way to where we need to go to get GHG emissions under control. Note that very little is needed here by way of technology, as the necessary changes can be made right now by both individuals and a range of groups and institutions. This is not to say that these changes will be easy. Indeed, it is arguably far easier to change cars, such as by making them electric, than to change people's actions, as issues like family planning are controversial across the planet, including the U.S., where Roe v. Wade may soon be challenged. Nonetheless, we need to seriously roll up our sleeves and address the climate crisis as a human problem in need of human solutions. Incidentally, many of these may well be win-win solutions, as giving girls and women equal access to education as well as control of their own bodies are obviously extraordinarily worthwhile goals in their own right. Similarly, reducing the global herd of 70 billion animals that we keep for food is obviously important from the perspective of animal rights. Hence, the changes that we need to make to address the climate crisis may not only be better for the planet, but for human beings and a range of beings in a host of ways. Science and technology-based solutions to cultural problems like the climate crisis are rarely sufficient in themselves. The simple fact is that they often fail to attend to the root causes of problems of this sort. This course will focus on these root causes. One of the interesting things about the human-based approach is that it returns, to echo a phrase from the 1960s, power to the people. In other words, you do not need to be a specialist in climate science or lithium-ion battery technology to make a dent in the climate crisis. Anyone can make a meaningful and indeed crucial impact on the climate crisis, either through personal action, collective activism, political action, or ideally through a combination of all three. This human-based approach can, in fact, be seen as a form of technology. In my most recent book, which is on moving forward to nature by writing a new environmental era, I argue that the human-based approach that we will be using in this course is in fact a form of technology. Allow me to explain by quoting a little from that book. The sciences can apply what they have learned to solve real-world problems. We generally refer to such applied science approaches as technology. What if we similarly used and applied humanities' approach to solve the problem? What if, after studying a problematic cultural practice, we then attempted to directly intervene by writing a new practice, or at least a new variation on an old one, into being? Conducting a cultural analysis of an existing problem would help explain why it came into being and what social needs it fulfills. Having learned this, we would be in a position to use this knowledge to propose something new that also addresses these needs, but in a better, more environmentally and socially responsible way. It's often said that the humanities, especially when compared to the STEM fields, and by that, of course, I mean science, technology, engineering, and math, have little to offer the world. To the contrary, the applied humanities approach being suggested here promises to have a great deal to offer, in many cases as much or even more than the applied sciences. This applied humanities approach can be seen as a form of technology. When talking about technology, we generally mean an application of knowledge, i.e. applied knowledge, that brings about a change in the world. Usually, this knowledge is scientific, but must it be? The applied knowledge, the technology, can just as easily come from the humanities. So let's again take the automobile as our example. Using an applied humanities approach, we could work on technologies to make cars more energy efficient and emit fewer greenhouse gases. Alternately, using an applied humanities approach, we could study something like commuting by bus in order to find out why it is so undesirable. Let's face it, nearly everyone hates it. If we could crack this nut by exploring how mass transportation was largely written out of American culture, by that I mean U.S. culture, as cars were written in, which did not happen, by the way, to such a degree in any other country, and then apply to what we learned to help make buses more appealing, we could advance a form of transportation that is a whopping 14 times more energy efficient than cars with a single occupant. Approached from the perspective of the applied sciences, a 1,400% increase in automobile efficiency is utterly unthinkable. Even 14% would be quite an achievement. However, an applied humanities approach could pull off such a feat by seeing this as a human problem brought about by human actions, which can be rewritten. This is why an applied humanities approach can often offer as much or even more than the applied sciences. This is not to say that rewriting transportation practices would be easy. Indeed, it's arguably easier to change cars, such as by making them electric, than to change people's actions. So, assuming that the humanities are important and have much to offer, why is this an issue for an English course? As I've noted, not only does the climate crisis need to be seen as a human problem brought about by human action, but the solutions to this crisis that have the greatest potential to impact the planet also center on human actions. But why exactly is this an issue for an English course? Wouldn't approaching this crisis from another field of the environmental humanities or the social sciences make sense? Well, the simple fact is that we really need everyone to address this issue, including the average person on the street and scholars, ranging from scientists to sociologists to specialists in the humanities. Nonetheless, the study of English does bring something unique to the table. The public is inundated daily with a broad range of material relating to the climate crisis. We know that fossil fuel interests annually spend hundreds of millions of dollars producing this material, which is often distributed by way of conservative think tanks like the Heartland Institute. Moreover, now that the climate crisis has become a politically polarized issue in America, a variety of media outlets, including a major news network, now spread the message of climate skepticism, outright denial, or encouraged delay. Alternately, scientists, scholars, journalists, and others are desperately trying to convince the public of the validity and urgency of the climate crisis. Confronted with this bewildering array of material, how does one get to the truth? This course takes the position that we can read through to the truth. In other words, since most people do not have a background in climate science or renewable technology, we have to rely on our ability to critically read a variety of materials in order to determine their validity. In this sense, teaching these skills of textual analysis, which is something that we do throughout this course, is central to our approach. On the other hand, what we read in this course is just as important as how we read it. Hence, instead of randomly selecting text to teach the art of careful reading, the course texts are designed to provide a comprehensive overview of the climate crisis and what we can do about it, as well as the debate that it has engendered in the U.S. In this sense, this course studies the culture and thought of the climate crisis, which is now largely two opposing cultures in the U.S. fiercely competing for dominance. In this course, these two projects, that's one, studying the culture and thought of the climate crisis, and two, learning how to read through to the truth of the matter, are not limited to written text. The last few decades of critical analysis have expanded our definition of what constitutes a text. Hence, for our purposes, a text can be a written work, a photograph or painting, a film or video, or a range of additional creations, and any of these can be read in our sense of being actively analyzed. In practice, this means that we will be analyzing both written works and documentaries that throw light on the climate crisis. But why focus on English texts in particular? There are a variety of reasons, but two in particular are worth noting. First, a significant number of texts that deny, in one way or another, the reality of the climate crisis or severity are written in English for American, British, Australian, and worldwide audiences. Second is 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere were put there by the United States. Understanding how this particular country has framed the issue is of unusual importance, as it can give us insights into how the crisis was brought about, and hopefully insights into what we can do to reinvent U.S. culture, which is now being exported to the world with disastrous results for our planet and its climate. Regarding this being an English course, it raises an interesting question. Should you agree with everything that is presented here? In a word, no. Given that our topic is the climate crisis, this may come as something of a surprise. I am certainly not suggesting that you deny the reality of anthropogenic climate change. Nonetheless, when students disagree with me, it's often a sign that I have succeeded at my job. So why? In part, it has to do with the humanities and our approach that we are employing here. If this were a class on the science of climate change, I would expect you to agree with most of the material presented here. For example, that a rise in global CO2 levels is having an impact on global temperature, while particularly advanced students, such as a PhD student working in the area, might, after years of work and research, be able to take exceptions to certain aspects of the relationship to CO2 levels to global atmospheric temperature rise presented at the lecture. This would be a major accomplishment and almost certainly not an intervention that would come from a student taking an introductory lecture. But the humanities are different. Imagine if we were not considering the climate crisis, but, using a more traditional example from the humanities, a poem. As your instructor, my job would be to introduce you to the poem and its context, get you focused on it, and to give you a range of materials to help you think about it in new and perhaps even unexpected ways. If your encounter with the poem went well, and that is, if you committed yourself and I did my job well, you would be able to offer up a reading of it, or at least a portion of one. My goal would not be to have you agree with me, but rather to mentor you in developing your own readings of this poem, which might be completely different than mine. If on an exam or an assigned essay, a student just repeated everything back that I had said about a poem, I would sadly conclude that I had failed to mentor them in the art of textual analysis. However, I would be really excited if they came up with their own way of approaching the text. Returning to this class and to the climate crisis, my job is to get you thinking about it in an informed way, which is not to say that you must agree with me. For example, I have a series of lectures focusing on the climate crisis as a generational issue. You might disagree with the approach in a variety of ways. First, you might draw attention to the fact that, when considering different positions on the climate crisis, the gulf between generations is not as great as the gulf between people of different political leanings, especially those individuals that think of themselves as either very conservative or very liberal. Alternately, you might feel that casting blame from one generation to another is not particularly helpful, and in fact, might even make things worse. Neither response is in any way wrong. In fact, I think that both of these reflections are useful and completely valid. If students had made such observations in their YouTube comments on my lecture, I would be more than a little gratified, as it would be clear that they were thinking hard about the climate crisis and how best to approach it. My goal is to get you to do just that.